I came to the UK a couple of days ago, and I have seen amazing things. And yesterday with the students at Cambridge, we were discussing, we were talking about politics, about economics, about ideas, and that's something that I want for my country. I think places like this one represents what I want. I want people talking about public policy, talking about solutions and ways to have a better country, to have a country in which we have less poverty, to have a country in which we have more opportunities for everyone. And that's what I want in my country. And also places like this one in which you can speak freely about your ideas and your convictions. Places in which you don't have a regime that will try to incarcerate you, or you don't have a regime that will try to, again, put you in jail simply because you want a better future, and simply because you have differences, fundamental differences with the regime. So what I will try to do tonight is I will speak, let's say for 20 minutes, and then we can start doing the Q&A. I want to answer all your questions about the current situation in Venezuela, about what happened and how we got here. Because, for example, yesterday when I was talking to students, there are questions about economics and, for example, hyperinflation. And we know the theory, and we know why that happened in Venezuela. Why do we have some incentives that created that? And in terms of the political aspect, and I told them, in Venezuela we don't have human rights, in Venezuela we don't have political freedom. But I think there is a question that is extremely interesting, is how we got here. Or even, did we see this happening 10, 15 years ago? And I cannot ask this question, I cannot answer this question myself, because when Chavez got elected, the former dictator of Venezuela, in 1998, I was 2 years old. So when I tried to ask my parents, I tried to ask my uncles, and my family and friends, if they envisioned that this could happen in Venezuela. And no one knew about it. No one saw it. Everyone thought that Venezuela was a country that was going to be prosperous, that was going to be better. And now look at us, 20 years after that. So I think the first message and the introductory message that I want to give you is that always fight for your ideas and your belief before it's too late. Here you can debate in media, you can debate in places like this one, and you can talk about the issues. In places like Venezuela, the only way that we can talk is in the streets, is protesting and risking our lives. Right now in Venezuela we have 400 political prisoners, people like you and I, that just believe in a better future. So the first thing that I'm going to address is the political part, then let's talk about economics, and let's finish about the international situation around Venezuela, the geopolitical aspect of things. So the first thing that you need to know is that Venezuela is in this huge crisis because we live in a socialist dictatorship. Because we live in a dictatorship that took all the means of production from the people and took all the political rights from the people. So it was a decision by the regime to simply put everyone without any economic or political rights. In Venezuela, politically, we cannot vote, we cannot elect our leaders. In Venezuela, we wanted to have free elections and fair elections with international observancy, and we were denied that. So why? Because you have a regime that is in there, in place, and doesn't want us to make a change in Venezuela, and doesn't allow the people to elect their leaders. In Venezuela, for example, 2 decades ago, we changed our constitution, so the executive branch has a lot of power in Venezuela. Venezuela is a petro-state, in which the state has too much power, and now it's too late. And the second big problem that we have in Venezuela is the economic one. And this is the one that I want to spend most time, because we're in the Institute of Economic Affairs. And Venezuela in the 1980s was the most developed nation in Latin America. It was the nation with highest social mobility, highest GDP per capita, highest growth. In fact, Venezuela was the highest growth in the world from 1920 to 1980. We grew by 6.4% per year. And that was Venezuela in the 1980s. It was the country with less inequality in Latin America. And everyone thought that Venezuela was going to the right direction, that Venezuela was going to be the exceptional place in Latin America. Latin America that has been always full of dictatorships, civil wars, insurrects by guerrilla groups of the far left. And Venezuela was different. Venezuela was a democracy. Venezuela was a thriving economy. And in the 1980s, again, Venezuela was seen as the best country in Latin America. What happened after that? In the 1980s and in the 1990s, we have very two difficult decades. In the 1980s, we declined our GDP by 0.76% per year. and then in the 90s by 1% per year. So it was 2 decades of declining GDP. Why that happened in Latin America everywhere? Because what we call the lost decade. We have a lot of products to export because we have higher interest rates throughout the world. Oil prices decline heavily for Venezuela, and we are an oil-dependent economy. And at the third time, we also had bad public policies at that time. Policies of more price caps, policies of more intervention of the state in the economy, and because that was what's happening in all the countries in Latin America. So by 1998, things were difficult. After 2 decades of low growth and no growth, even declining, and people felt that the system was betraying them. People felt that the system was not fair with them, and that they needed a change, a radical change. And they elected an outsider, who was Hugo Chavez in 1998, a former military person, a person that made a failed coup d'etat in 1998. And what happened is that things got very, very bad after that. Because Chavez had too much power. Again, he changed the constitution. He took control of the oil industry in Venezuela. He started taking control of telecommunications. He started taking control of almost all sectors in Venezuela. In Venezuela, more than 50% of the economy has been expropriated, and the other 50% has experienced price caps, production quotas, currency controls, and basically zero proper property rights. In the business environment in Venezuela is, I think, the second worst in the entire world, just after Cuba, and of course, North Korea. And that's the situation. So that happened in Venezuela. Sadly, it was a missed opportunity, because during the Chavez years, we had the highest oil bonanza on history of the country. We received, and imagine this, $1 trillion for a Latin American country in terms of development. It was the biggest missed opportunity that we have in our country. $1 trillion in a period of 14 years could be a way to start a development path in Venezuela. And what resulted was mismanagement. What resulted was extreme corruption. It started having subsidies for the rich people and paying it with the oil money, and for the poor people, clientelistic policies that ask people for a vote if you want housing, if you want healthcare. So they told people, there are polls that 60% of people in Venezuela were asked for a political favor if they want, for example, access to housing or even legal services. In Venezuela, the judicial system is the worst in the region. It's a judicial system that is biased, unbalanced, arbitrary, a judicial system that always favors the regime. So in Venezuela, you have an economic crisis. Why? First of all, how bad is the economic crisis? We have lost 60% of GDP in 5 years. Imagine that twice the Great Depression, that twice the Greek crisis, that twice the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. So we have lost 60% for GDP in the last 5 years. And not only that, because of 1 million percent hyperinflation of last year, and also the bad labor policies that made it so strict and so difficult to hire people, the minimum wage has lost 95% of its value in the last 5 years. Imagine that. And that's why you have a humanitarian crisis. Because most people in Venezuela that have minimum wage, they cannot afford even to eat. According to the UN, right now 7 million Venezuelans need shelter, medicine, food right now. That they're in a humanitarian danger. 7 million people. The same United Nations that 2 weeks ago voted Venezuela to win the Human Rights Commission. So imagine the contradiction. And that's why also you are seeing 5 million people leaving the nation. In Venezuela, we have lost 30% of our population in just a few years. People that are going, why? Because they want freedom, because they want opportunities, because they want to provide for their families. And right now we have 2 million people in Colombia, and you have people all over the place, Venezuelans. I saw many of them in Cambridge, I saw many of them in London today. And there are people that just left Venezuela, because in Venezuela the main problem is that you have a regime that is telling every single person that that you cannot prosper in Venezuela, that you cannot progress in Venezuela, that if you want to study hard, you cannot do it, that you want to work hard, you cannot do it. And all the policies are in place to put people dependent on the state. That's the biggest problem in Venezuela. It's not oil revenues, It's not the decline in oil prices. The recession in Venezuela began in 2013. Oil prices started declining in 2014, and they're picking up right now again. And at the same time, you don't see a humanitarian crisis in other oil-dependent nations. You don't have that. And so all the problems in terms of Venezuela are because of policies, not oil, not sanctions. For example, many people talk about the US sanctions, for example, being the problem of Venezuela. That's not true. The sanctions are mainly towards officials in the regime and towards financial decisions that they want to do. And the government destroyed the private sector, and the government also destroyed the oil industry. When Chavez took office in 1998, we used to produce 3.5 million barrels per day. That was pretty good. Venezuela was, in fact, PDVSA, the company there, was the most productive oil company in terms of per worker productivity in the world. Now we're producing 600,000 barrels. Imagine the loss in revenue, and again, in the highest oil bonanza ever that we all received. When Chavez took office, oil prices were extremely low, the lowest in years. By 2008, oil prices were around $100 per barrel. And that's why Chavez was able to also have a lot of debt, because you know that financially international debt is pro-cyclical. So when you have a lot of oil revenues, you're able to borrow more at lower interest rates. So he indebted the country for 200% of GDP. And right now also they cannot pay that as well, because obviously they don't have the money to do it. And so Venezuela will destroy that opportunity. That in fact, in the Chavez year, consumption was up 150%. But it was all consumption, it was not investment, it was not productivity, it was just subsidies for the rich and the poor equally, for clientelar reasons. So in Venezuela right now, you are seeing the worst of the worst, because you have a private sector that cannot operate, because when you don't have rule of law, because when you don't have private property, because when you don't have the system of prices working for you. In Venezuela right now, you have price caps in almost all products. I think 80% of products have price caps. And in the other ones, production quotas, and in the other ones, you have currency control, so you cannot import. So the private sector is completely destroyed. And the same happened with the public sector. They create a public sector that's extremely big, bureaucratic, and also affiliated with the regime. So in Venezuela, you don't have the provision of the basic public goods, such as collective security, such as infrastructure that you need, such as these basic public goods that also economies need to function. In Venezuela, for example, if you have an industry, how can you access inputs? If the industries have been expropriated, and you cannot import, you don't have international trade, and also you don't have the infrastructure to do it. And above all, you have the highest levels of criminality in the history of the country. When Chavez took office, there was 3,000 murders per year. Now we have 40,000.
Really?
Yeah. And that affects both the people, because that's the most important thing, but also affects companies. If you're in agriculture, agriculture is by excellence the sector that is most affected by these levels of criminality. Among the 10 most dangerous cities in the world, I think 3 are in Venezuela. Caracas, the capital, is one of the most unsafe cities in the world right now. So you are seeing an increase in criminality. That also is another factor why we have this humanitarian crisis. That's another factor that we have this migratory crisis, because people are escaping all of this. People are escaping a country in which, again, the private sector cannot function and the public sector do not function. 70% of the Venezuelan territory is controlled by, not by the state, but by maybe the terrorists, maybe criminal groups, and we'll go into that. So Venezuela is also a failed state in that regard. And how we will fix that? That's the question that right now we are talking in the opposition. How we will rebuild a country that has nothing right now? How can we rebuild a country that will also give hope to our people? That we also find ways to connect the people that left with the people that are inside Venezuela. That we find ways to connect the people that, for example, are here in London or in Cambridge studying. How can we make them connect to people in Venezuela so we can have we can have a better market, so we can have a better future. That's the challenge that we have right now. So to talk about the international aspect of things, Venezuela became a problem of the security of the region. I already talked about the migratory crisis. Countries like Colombia cannot receive 2 million Venezuelans. They don't have the infrastructure to do it. They don't have the jobs to afford all those people. They don't have the healthcare to afford to those people. So how we will address that? How we will internationally cooperate to address that migratory crisis that right now is only comparable to Syria, the Syrian refugee crisis. And for example, in the Syrian refugee crisis, the international community has spent $10 billion. In the Venezuelan case, only like 200 million. So what are we going to do? And again, the only way to change this is to have a political change. Anything else will just be little solutions here and there. But people will keep leaving the country if the situation continues, because who would like to live in a country in which you don't have any opportunity? I have cousins of 12, 13 years old in Venezuela, and they tell me, Jorge, as soon as I leave high school, I will just go somewhere else, because I don't have a future here. How I'm gonna have a girlfriend, I invite her to dinner, I'm gonna have a, and those are what the people are thinking right now. So, according to the Organization of American States, if the crisis continues, the number of people who have left Venezuela by the end of next year will be close to 10 million people, of a country that Venezuela was a little bit less than 30 million people. That's something that is worrying. So the migratory crisis is one aspect of the geopolitical problem that we have right now. The second one is that Venezuela and the regime has close connections with enemies of the West, Russia, Cuba, some kind of business connections with China, and above all, connections with drug dealers and with criminal groups like Hezbollah. And again, this is not me saying it, it's the Department of State. And you can go to Google, you can go to the Department of State and read their reports. There are close ties and close connections between the regime and drug trafficking, between the regime and criminal groups. And that's something that should worry everyone, because you cannot have a country in the middle of the continent that is hijacked by criminal groups and is creating a migratory crisis that is going to all these countries. And that's why Venezuela has become a problem not only for us Venezuelans, but for the region. And that's why we are here trying to work with everyone that wants to find a solution to all of this, because we need to have a solution. And also, in the moral terms, we need to have a solution for Venezuela so we don't have other countries going through this process again. We need to be clear that we will not accept to have countries without human rights, without economic rights, without political rights. We cannot accept that. We cannot accept thugs going to a government and hijacking a country. We cannot accept that. And just to finish, what I want to say is that in Venezuela we have a plan. We, the people that believe in democracy and freedom, we have a plan to reconquer our nation. We believe in a nation that has democracy, rule of law, a nation that has economic rights for everyone. That's the type of country that we believe. And we are organizing people inside Venezuela, we're organizing people outside Venezuela, so we can make that happen. But for that, we need the people from the world to help us. We need you telling everyone what is happening in Venezuela. We need you telling everyone that in Venezuela we don't have human rights, that we don't have political rights, and that we don't have any chance of living a prosperous life if we don't have a political change in Venezuela. There is no middle ground here. Either you are in a dictatorship that has people oppressed and in poverty, or you live in a liberal democracy that offers people opportunities to be free and to have a thriving life. And the second thing that I would like to tell you is that if you're here listening to my talk right now, it's because despite our different nationalities, maybe our different religions, maybe our different political ideology, there's something that goes above that. And that's that we all care about human rights. And that we all care about the fundamental principles that we need to have to respect people. That people have a right to vote for their leaders, one vote for every person. That people have a right to prosper, to have the economic opportunities to have a family and to live a fulfilled life. that people have a right to live in a country in which they can express themselves freely, all their opinions. In a future Venezuela, if there are people that still believe, for example, in communism, I will respect them, and we will debate, and we will debate hard. But after all, everyone is to be free to express their opinions. And that's the type of politics that I want. I want a politics in which we can all talk about our ideas, but with tolerance, with civilism, and maybe because you don't agree with me, you are not an enemy. Because that's also something that I saw in Venezuela since I was very young. I remember one guy, Chavez, talking on the TV every single day that if you don't agree with him, then you are an enemy. Then if you don't agree with the regime, then you are a traitor. And it's not like that. When you have politicians telling you that your brothers are your enemies, be aware of that. Because politics should be about consensus. Politics should be about talking about the problems that we all care about. Because I think we all care about the problems that we face right now. Because there are people that right now, that they don't have, today is the 30th of October. There are people that tomorrow don't know how to pay rent. And I think those are the people that we want to help. I think we need to tell them that our policies, the policy of economic freedom, of rule of law, the policy that give people independence from the state, are the policies that will make them free. And are the policies that will make them live the better lives that they can. And that we are here for them. And that we don't forget them. Because that's also something that I saw in Venezuela, is that we left the left talking to them, and we didn't approach to them. And I think that's something that we need to do, approach to the people that feel that the system has betrayed them, and that they feel that they don't have enough to pay the rent and to send their kids to colleges. And I think it's our responsibility to tell them that we believe that with our ideas, the ideas of freedom, the ideas of a government that is responsible, of a government that is democratic, and of a government that respects people's freedom. And I think with those ideas, I think in 50 years we can have a world with less poverty. So thank you very much, and let's go to the Q&A.